power flow for Zyy. Zyy, like Zyy, is an objective discernment power. And I'll probably go through a mirror with Zyy as I've done with some of the other ones, as they have a corollary in what they do. If you remember, Zyy, perfection is a kind of harmony, and harmony is kind of perfection. So they seem very different, but there is a similarity, and they kind of address the same thing. So in this case, you have the concept of the system. This is the dynamics that Zyy is concerned with. The system, even before it has any real world form, it is like a spirit form. So like all the other pod powers, it's a concept. So it's a spirit form concept of the system, and Zyy comes innately wired with this. It understands and knows that there is a system, and that's how Zyy knows itself. When it thinks itself, it thinks of the system. The lobbying. As mentioned before, each of the pod powers has a concept that's basically on their mind, and they advocate for. So there is either innate state or constant qualities that go along with this. In this case, it's going to be constant qualities because this is a discernment power. So what are these constant qualities that immediately relate to the system? So simply by having that concept, these constant qualities go with that. The first one, there'll be three, is systemic logic / sense of order. Because there is a system, that inherently means, this relates, for example, with Zyy, since there are a people, there is connection / sense of community. If there's a people, then you are connected to it. If there's a system, that implies, it's important to the objective discernment powers, that you're connected to it. That's different than the subjective discernment powers, which are more personal. These are impersonal in that they're outward, but they are connected to the person, whoever has the objective discernment power, but they see it as a thing they're a part of with something else. In this case, the system. So they and the system kind of are like dance partners. And that brings up the next part. What kind of dance partner would you be? Well, the second part of the power flow is directness and efficiency. Because the environment can be understood by various dynamics, if you cross-index the environment based on systemic logic and a sense of order, then that implies how you would traverse it, how you would navigate it. Does that make sense? You would navigate it based on that's the way it's moving. It moves because of systemic logic. Therefore, there's an order to it of which I'm a part of order. So if I want to do anything, the best thing to do is to basically make contact with the system and see how it's done, and then make the move. And that kind of thinking will be perceived by the rest of the pod powers, and thus other mojos in the world, as being very direct and efficient. Because there are other dynamics going on. There are dynamics such as Zyy dynamics, and there are miscellaneous general stimulus coming from Ni and from V. So there are other extreme, if you interpret it this way, separate from the system and the way the system is doing things, there are more extraneous pod powers. So in this context, Zyy is the least extraneous as far as how the system gets things done. It knows that, so it makes moves. It doesn't factor other stuff in because that would be a waste of time. And for that reason, it has a bearing that is direct and efficient. This correlates with Zyy, personal consideration and social awareness, because that's what this dynamic likes. If you think of it, the system, almost like a person, it likes being interacted with directly. So it favors being interacted directly. So if you have Zyy, there's an awareness of the spirit form of the system, and if the system is responding to your maneuvers. And that's what these powers are doing, they're steering. So it's going to pay attention to if the system is responding well. And the system does respond well to directness and efficiency. If not, your score goes down. Okay. Once you have as a constant quality that you are connected to the system. So there's a logic to it, which I am a part of, thus there's order, and I'm a part of this order. Then there is a direct and efficient way to do things. That implies that you could not do it directly and efficiently. That's important. That is inherently seen as weak, and Zyy and Zyy are very concerned with weakness and strength. So if there is a system and an order, and then there is an efficient and direct way of doing it, then there is most efficient and most direct, as opposed to less so. And for this reason, there is an innate ambition to be the most efficient, the most direct. And that tends to work in terms of things like ranking or so forth, because that's the most efficient way to get your will to be done. And that's what Zyy is concerned about. Both Zyy and G are about making the will, the psyche, be done. The worldview is kind of like a map, and this is like how you're going to do it. So, if you are more direct, more efficient in a system, you're going to rise in that system. The fact that you're doing that and the need for that to be done, other people will interpret, the pod powers will interpret as ambition. This desire to move up this system. Does that make sense? Because, for example, if you understand that a system has 4 categories, with one being better than the other, then instantly there is a desire, like right automatically with that, to want to be the top one. Does that make sense? If you understand the system and like this category is the most efficient, then this one, then I'm that one. If not now, then I want to be. And so that is innate ambition. And that not only would you want to be, but that if you didn't want to be, life would be incomplete. This very much relates to the Zyy with the need for rituals, that it's a need, and kind of putting these powers in service, you'd be kind of bored. If you didn't have this to do, what would you do with yourself? So Zyy needs to have something to climb up. So it will, in any system it's in, it will assess that, and it'll want to climb up. This is important. We've not yet really had Zyy do anything yet. All the powers will do this first. This is simply the character of Zyy in the psyche, and it's because in the psyche, even as a fetus, its understanding itself came from the system. Okay, so now that's just kind of like the siblings. That's a sibling that knows that and is concerned about that, and so raises its hand like, "Ooh, let's do this," and that's just like will to shine. What's really good looking? That's kind of like the constant qualities and innate states for all the powers. It's kind of like their will to shine. Even without experiencing the world at all, they already think that is just would be cool and we should probably do that a lot. Okay. So they raise their hand, the psyche says, okay, you know, we're gonna put you in. So next thing is, what will Zyy do if the psyche, kind of like a producer, gives it some resources? Okay, here's some money, go do something with it. Well, the first thing it's going to want to do is, similar to all the discernment powers, the middle trio is kind of like a detection phase. It wants to understand. So since it has that conceptual understanding, it'll want to put that into an understanding of what's going on in the actual environment. So the first part, there's 4, 5, and 6 of this, is strategizing/game plan. All pod powers can do it, but in this case with Zyy, it's really, I think, easy to see it, because you see it so often in in political debates and sports and so forth, is the concept of the system, and then therefore the various attributes you're trying to hold on to can be laid over any activity, any company, any organization, a family, really anything. And when that's done, like a system grid or a systemic read of how that's working can be done. Does that make sense? So as that's happening, it's almost kind of one thing. The game plan of the Zyy user will arrive as they are laying over systemic dynamics over this one. And that's why it's objective. They can do that for anything that is in the external environment or anyone else is working on. They can lay, which is why even though you have, for example, something that's considered very good in Zyy users can constantly try to improve that, because the concept of the system is, well, like Zyy, it's a perfect thing. It's a concept, which means you're always trying to strive to get it, and you could always be more efficient, more direct, yada, 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 because the spirit form for directness never is fully satisfied in the real world, and you wouldn't want it to be, otherwise it would stop being all charged up to its job. So you want your pot powers to be, you know, constantly hungry. Okay, so when they do this, this relates to like the tribal dynamics of Zyy. Before a push can be done, and that's important, both Zyy and Zyy, they want to push, they need to, that's their job. So they have to make sure they have it right, because they're going to generate, of all the powers, these two generate the most impact in the environment. That is their specific function, is to push, to pull, to steer, and they have to make sure they understand this system. So, for example, if it's a problem or it's a company and you're going to figure how you're going to roll out, it'll attempt to understand all the systems that are relevant before doing anything else. As the relevant systems are understood, usually that will start telling the individual, as it always happens with objective CERN powers, it's done in an objective, universal sense, and that tells them how they should play. So once the layover is done with the conceptual of the system and being direct and efficient and the need for challenge is, okay, here's this system, and how am I going to do that? What's the most direct way to win? And that's, Zyy is very concerned always with winning in that context, although technically really so is Zyy and most left-brain powers. But in the classical sense that most people are familiar with, is Zyy is the most interested in winning. Winning is inherently important. And that's because when you think of winning, most people think of like medals and things like that, and those are external ranking dynamics. That's a system. And so when you think of winning, you tend to think of like how a person plays in a system. And so Zyy thinks in those classical terms of winning. So in order to have the most comprehensive understanding of the winning, you would have to know all the dynamics. And that's something that Zyy and Zyy understand. Very different than Zyy and Zyy, which are all about equilibrium. These powers anticipate conflicting factions within their own. Zyy and Zyy aren't like that. The conflict is from without. And then they do also, being a certain powers, understand inherently there will be stress. But that's something brought to them. Zyy and Zyy aren't that way. They understand that, for example, in any dynamics, it's a royal. It's a conflagration. And these, I'm calling factionary forces, what I've come up with. These factionary forces vie for one another. And that's okay, that's just the way it works. And so Z's job in this case is to figure out which of these factionary forces are relevant to them, which ones are going to win, which ones perhaps could absorb another one so they're not factionary, it's just one larger force. So all these kind of considerations, but understanding that this will be ongoing, that always you'll have to look at your company and strategize, so to speak, and figure out who needs to be given more or less, who goes first, who goes second, who goes last, who doesn't go at all. And that's based upon the idea of, in any systemic dynamics, there's going to be factionary forces, and you're going to have to, it's interesting because you think of Zyy this way, but Zy's the same thing too, ally yourself with the strong ones. So that's what it's going to do. It's going to understand there will not be a consensus, there's going to have to be an attempt at consensus, in this case a systemic consensus, but there won't always be consensus, and you'll have to strategize to make sure that you and your team or your company or whatever, your system wins. And that's the heart of strategizing. This is the system as it works. Here is where I am in the system. How do I win? In fact, all the Zyy powers are pretty much ... and then how do I win? Next, organizing / planning. This relates again with Zyy. There's the tribal dynamics, which is kind of a larger scope, and you kind of need to think of that because that affects everything else. But when you come to actually like doing it, you're not interacting with the whole tribe, you're interacting with people, so that's more specific. Same thing here. Strategizing is like, oh, here's the whole company, for example, and it needs to do this, that's our plan. But you're not doing all the work, there's certain parts that you're doing, and certain parts that other people need to do. And so that's what happens, it's the actual delegating of who or what is going to do what. Resource management, and Zyy is just the best of that, and overall, just a raw tactical sense of allocating which resources need to go where in order to get the most bang for the buck. It's not doing well here, move it over here. It's doing well here, crank it up. Again, similar to Zyy that way, but that's more like in a reactionary way. This is more in a planned way. It's going to try to actually figure out where the strong and weak spots are. And also where their role is, because like Zyy, it understands that in a system, it's one part of it. So even if it's the leader, then there will be more to do, and this is very different than the subjective discernment. There's going to be much more to do than the individual can do. So there's going to need to be an organization and a planning of who is going to do what. And again, this relates back to the hierarchy and the ranking and things like that. Next, you're not always going to be able to get everything. So how do you make those calls? Well, with Zyy, it was based on diplomacy. When there's friction between factionary forces interpersonally or between interpersonal and the tribe and vice versa, what do? Try to go diplomacy. In this case, there's again going to be problems. In the strategizing, perhaps one strategy interferes with another strategy, but you actually want both these factionary forces to win. That happens. There's two forces that Zyy actually is advocating for. They want both of them to win. But who goes first? Things like that. Next is in organizing and planning. There can be crunches, and you have to decide on, again, what goes ahead of what. These powers are very concerned with ordering of something, the sequencing of something. In this case, it's directly related to strength and weakness. Things that are strong should go first so they can continue to do whatever it is they were doing strong. Weak things should be traded out and replaced, and again, so for maximum efficiency. What's used here is called scheduling and sequencing. Usually Zyy users will go with time. If I had to pick one, there's other things too, but usually scheduling is what they use for, I can't do this. That amount of work or that amount of thing can't be done because we have 4 days and that kind of work takes it. And so it uses those criteria for making judgment calls when different factionary forces, particularly perhaps the ones that they both want. It's factionary forces, the Zyy person's like, I want this department to get what it wants and I want this department to get what it wants. But there's not enough time. Okay, which department is closer to deliverables? Okay, I'm going to put my energy on that one. Does that make sense? So it'll frequently go with what is further along, what is stronger, what has the closest chance of winning, what's the most high percentage play, and it'll use that to decide, okay, well, can't get everything, we'll go with these. Those are the ones you go with first when you have to decide. And again, that is what it's there for, is to make those kinds of decisions. So yes, those are things it's going to use to detect and do in what I would call a more cerebral state or inward state. In fact, you kind of look at it this way, is the first one, the innate qualities, are almost like pure spirit form, because they're there almost with no contact being given by the environment at all. The next trio is when you're considering the environment, but you do have some removal from it. Does that make sense? And Zyy also has that as well. Then you're going to engage. Okay, so this is the third trio. So you're like, this is how I believe you should do things. Here's my assessment, and make it happen. What's that problem? Star Trek. The first thing it's going to want to do is protocol implementation / SOP enforcement. This relates to Zyy with the team building and shepherding. Once you've got things lined up, you now basically want to walk it. You want to walk the plan you had through and make sure it happens, because in your head it makes total sense that if it's good Zyy, it is correct. So now it must be done. And this is different, as any Zyy will tell you, is you get people to agree with the game plan, but when it actually comes to doing it, either A, the environment seems somehow confusing and they need to be articulated. This is protocol implementation, explaining this is what we said was going to happen. Remember, you're supposed to do this, this, and this. So basically, getting people to start the tumblers rolling of being involved of really the system's plan. Because that's what you do when you strategize. You kind of go on the plan that the system's going to do, and then you delegate who's going to do what, and then you're like, okay, now we're going to do it. And so you basically have to tell them. You have to give orders. So protocol implementation has a lot to do with the giving of orders. And both for proactive, so protocol implementation is, okay, boys and girls, this is what we planned for. It is now arrived, and so let's do it. Remember, we did this and this, and the next thing is this and this, and so we're going to get these things. But also SOP enforcement is, as they're doing that, it's kind of the same part. No. Don't you remember, that's not what we said. We said we were going to go get the fire extinguisher first. Because they agreed to that, SOP, but now they're not doing what they agreed upon. So the first thing is saying, okay, this is the situation, protocol implementation, let's do it. Let's now do it because the moment has come. My Zyy says the dynamic is right? The time has arrived, let's do it. But then you have to make sure they do it correctly, because they may not. Particularly they don't have Zyy very high up. Their chances for coming up with other things that are not related to the system cohesively working. And that's going to take away from the overall game plan. And Zy's very good with that in its own way. Both Zyy and Zyy are very good at cohesion. In one you think more team building, and this way you think more of like, troops, but it's the same thing, is understanding that there was an idea in the head and we had kind of like a consensus of more than ourselves. And then we're going to implement, we should keep that force of greater than ourselves. And if not, then it usually means that some underling is fucking up and they need to be corrected. SOP enforcement. Now, as the situation unfolds, it's going to keep shifting. So the protocols that you may have come up with, maybe you had, let's say real simple here, 4 protocols. As the environment unfolds, you'll shift through these various protocols as the situation does. How do you know that? And how do you say that? Decisive, straightforward. Because of the systemic connection that happens from the beginning, as the environment shifts, there's a direct connection to how that affects the game plan. So when environmental shifts make for protocol or game plan shifts, there's an immediate knowing of it, and again, left brain quality, assuredness to it. It's very decisive. It recognizes that, and there's not any fuzziness. There's no fuzziness on the initial understanding of it, and this comes out, same entry here, in the way that is articulated to the other people or other parts of the system, which is, oh, dynamic shift, move here. Instant recognition, and then usually a very clear and concise of, and now we have to go to protocol 2. Dynamic shift, protocol 3. Shift again, protocol 1. And quick recognition, and that's why Zyy is classically known for like military stuff and crisis control, because it's very good understanding, like, even though blood spurting and things like that, that's technically a systemic dynamic shift. And that really, in the pure Zyy sense, means do protocol B. It doesn't mean freak out or have any other kind of psyche or reaction to psyche. It simply means dynamic shift. And if we plan for this, then we know that that protocol is, and we just note that. And when the surgeon notes that, all the surgeons hopefully have Zyy should go, yeah. And that's it, they all shift together. That's the power of the objective discernment powers, is they can bring in larger forces than themselves, because if the other forces agree upon it and they speak this language, and as a dynamic shift in the real environment, whoever's in charge of the Zyy, for example, can say things like, oh, dynamic shifted, and like you see military troops always doing, the rest of whoever is involved in that, they all know what that means, and it can be a very quick shifting of large forces. Both Zyy and Zyy have that ability, and it's really awesome. There's only one 2 powers that can do that. But it's because they understand how this system relates to this system, and they keep adjusting the two in order that they win. So there's actually 3 points. There's the point of the concept of a system. Then there's a system that's actually happening, and then there's the Zyy users, where am I in the system? And because of that, that's also, go back to earlier, why they're naturally going to want to have ambition and rise up, because once you have the universal concept of a system and you actually have the real one, then of course they want to go up high. But making decisions that win need to be done quickly and clearly, and that's 2 things to focus on there with the decisive and straightforward, is systemic dynamic shifts are noted quickly, and the shifts can be articulated to others very concisely, very clearly. so that they can, or it, because it doesn't have to even, it can even be a computer. So the other systemic forces can continue to add their forces to you. That's important. Zyy and G are very good at continuing to get community or universal services or powers used for their cause. Does that make sense? So a good way to think of that is very much like a conductor. And Zyy really has all that conductor kind of energy to it. Is if you do it correctly, then the concerted energies keep being under the power of the director, the conductor. Does that make sense? But if they lose touch of that, then they can't do it. And there's kind of two things going on, isn't there? Three things. There is the concert piece that they had in their head. And now they have these people playing, and the sounds they're making with the instrument, their current level of tunage, is a current system dynamic. And then the conductor is trying to get the most out of it. Like Zyy is trying to squeeze all the power out of that it can. And if you're slow in recognizing shifts and unclear in articulating those shifts to the other people in the system, you're going to lose. You're going to lose power. For every moment that you take to recognize a shift and to say it, loss of power. And for any lack of clarity into articulating that to other people, and like I'm doing now with Zyy, more being rounded and verbose. Zyy does not do that, and a lot of times that is a superior way, particularly when you want systemic dynamics to like what you're doing. Systemic dynamics do not like circuitous, they like straightforward. If you work on a computer or programming, you'll understand that actually math likes straightforward, it doesn't like circuitous. Okay, now, again, similar to Zyy, there has to be and all the discernment powers, there's always that kind of like, that line where the discernment power is going to decide how things go one way or another. So in this case, when the factionary forces are problematic in the mental state, usually, or the preemptive state, usually scheduling or sequencing is used to try to hash out those problems. Does that make sense? And hopefully if good scheduling sequencing is done, that hash out can be done without any energy engagement. Okay, but now we're at the engagement phase. So again, there's going to be the possibility of factionary forces not going together well, and what do we do then? Or if not going together well, they simply are not going to agree. That's going to happen. And so Zyy and Zyy are about what do you do when they don't agree. Okay, well, for Zyy, it's basically going to go with being authoritative / hierarchical. If there is a conflict of interest within the systemic dynamics, and the Zyy user is trying to be decisive and straightforward, and they are being decisive and straightforward, but now there's still an issue. Usually that's going to mean that some other Zyy dynamic is also being decisive and straightforward with all those other kind of attributes. And now these two things are hitting one another. If you could use schedule and sequence and get rid of that, great, blah, blah. There's other tactics that'll be used, but sometimes they just aren't. Authority. The person with the greater strength has right of way, straight up. Zyy is the most concerned about raw power of all the pod powers. So if they have the greater power, they go first. A good Zyy user will make this the last play. Similar to like with Zyy, code of conduct, like two people are going to be unhappy, what do I do? Code of conduct. It's kind of what you go with when you're simply not going to be able to make both factionary forces go together. So one will have to go. Here, same thing. Authoritative, and that can also go hierarchical. A good Zyy user will bow to superior authority of someone else. So if they're making clear decisions and it seems good to them, but someone else is making clear decisions and both seem to be doing well there, but these conflict, what do you do then? Then it goes to who has the most right and the most strength. And the two are very much related. In fact, Zyy, if it's healthy, relates the two. The person with the most ability, the most knowledge, the system, whatever, that actually is the strongest, that is the one that should be deferred to. If there's going to be vying, and it's important, Zyy and Zyy understand that there will be vying, and that's their job, is to vie and to decide on contests of vying. In this case, not vie back here, but like vying of strengths, I mean. But it's important to note this, that the Zyy is healthy. The reason it's doing this is it wants to go back to the systemic logic and the sense of order and the concept of a system that's like perfect. The same way Zyy with the dynamics for the people should be harmonious or it's not being done well. Zyy wants a system to be perfect or it's not a good system. So in order for a system to be perfect though, the Zyy should always look for the strength of the system over the individual interest. And that's why the authoritativeness comes actually from a hierarchical way of understanding, which means if I have the higher hierarchy here because of power, knowledge, or rank, whatever, then I go either right of way. But if someone else has the greater strength or time and rank, understanding, whatever, then I should prefer that because that keeps order. That's a world that has order. Does that make sense? So Zyy, proper Zyy user will want there to be a strict hierarchy between themselves and those above them, those below them, and their peers. And then of course they're going to want to have the highest status they can because of that way of understanding. But wherever they are, if it's a healthy Zyy, they're going to want to actually perform that perfectly. And it often involves, and this is why Zyy is the most removed from Zyy. Without personal considerations, often sometimes what you need to do in order to get good at a test means crunching and studying in a way that's uncomfortable. Zyy will often do that because Z's like, well, it doesn't matter if it's uncomfortable. If you want to have a higher relationship to your peers than before, you have to score good in this test, and there's really nothing else to that. You have to do that. Does that make sense? And so that makes for, in a way, it's funny because Zyy and Zyy can often be seen as conflict and so forth, but really if they're healthy, they're about conflict resolution. It's about the quickest way to actually get the train continuing to go forward. That's what they want to have happen. But they understand that because of outward dynamics will conflict, and so you'll have to steer through them and you'll have to make decisions on which dynamics to go with. Okay, so I think I've already said this here. The overall theme is systemic dynamics and relationships, and that includes all of this, and that's a way of understanding the world, your role in it, based on a concept of a system that is perfect. Now, last thing, the distinct signal. The distinct signal is going to be, if I haven't already said the word here, but it's definitely forceful. That's the quality that I most associate with Zyy and Zyy users, and it's because it's their language. If you understand what I've said so far, you understand that basically they bid. Most of the objective discernment powers, whenever things come up, they make bids of why it should go this way or another way. Zyy makes bids based on power bids. In fact, if anyone made power bids, it'd be Zyy. I mean, really classic. And for this reason, even in normal situations, not like power bids, but they put forward their opinions, their positions, their game plans, their ideas from the point of view of why it's strong. That is going to strike the other pod powers as forceful because they advocate very much for their point of view of the psyche, but they advocate using different stuff to say why it should be listened to. The reason Zyy says it should be listened to is because this way stronger, we should do this way stronger. And so that's the criteria, so people are like, wow, that's very forceful. But when you understand it, it's like all the signals, it's really a language. Forcefulness is just a kind of language of binary code of strength, of putting forward to, in this case, the collective, what is strong and what is not strong. And Zyy is always this important too, because it understands that. It understands beginning, middle, end. It also understands first, after, and last. And because of that, you lead with your best foot forward. The same reason why, like Zyy, why are they so dogmatic? Why are they so this and that? Because they're putting their best foot forward. That's how they do it. Well, for Zyy, you lead with your strongest card. And then you are asked for more cards. You give cards that are not as strong afterwards. But whenever you're called upon, Zy's first thing is to go get or find the strongest answer. So if you talk to Zyy, as the other pod powers do, Zyy is always saying, hey, here's the strongest card in the deck, and here's another strongest card in the deck. And so that's a language, but it's a language that is very forceful, but rightly so.